The forest had been silent, until a veteran Navy SEAL opened his gate to a pregnant stranger with nowhere to go. He didn't trust her, but his dog made a choice he couldn't ignore. What began as shelter slowly became something more, something fragile, something real. Then one night, her past came back, loud, dangerous, and ready to take it all. The dog moved first, the man stood firm, and one moment changed everything. Because sometimes letting someone stay is the bravest choice you can make. Before we begin, tell us where you're watching from and like and subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. Late winter had not fully left northern Montana. It lingered in the pine forest like an old soldier who had forgotten how to go home. Snow still hid in the shadowed roots of the trees. The ground was dark with thaw, soft beneath the boots, and every gust of wind carried the clean, sharp smell of cold soil, wet bark, and distant mountain water. Caleb Rourke stood beside the fence line with a hammer in his right hand. He was 43 years old, 6'1", broad through the shoulders, and built with the hard, practical strength of a man who had once trained his body to survive what ordinary men were never meant to see. His face was angular, the jawline sharp beneath a short, rough beard. His deep blue-gray eyes moved constantly, not nervous, only trained. His skin was tanned from years under hostile suns and harsher weather. His dark brown military-cut hair had begun to silver at the temples, as if time had touched him there first and decided not to apologize. He wore the same clothes he wore most days, an olive field jacket faded at the elbows, a red and dark blue plaid shirt beneath it, dark blue cargo pants, worn brown leather boots, and an old military watch strapped to his wrist. Nothing about him was decorative. Everything had a purpose. The hammer rose and fell. Clean strike. Pause. Clean strike. Beside him, Ranger watched the tree line. The German Shepherd K9 was 6 years old, black and tan with short, dense fur and a balanced, muscular frame. He stood with the quiet authority of a working dog who did not waste movement. His black collar sat close against his thick neck. His ears were upright. His dark eyes scanned the yard, the fence, the road, the pines. Ranger rarely barked. He did not need to. Most people understood the warning in his silence. Caleb drove another nail into the leaning fence post. The wood groaned, old and stubborn. "Don't look at me like that," he muttered without turning. "It's not crooked." Ranger glanced at the post. Caleb followed the dog's gaze, saw the slight angle, and exhaled through his nose. "All right. It's emotionally straight." That was the closest thing to humor the old farm had heard all week. The place was not truly a farm anymore. Not the way it had been when Caleb's mother was alive. It was a weathered log house set back from a dirt road, surrounded by pine woods, a broken fence, and an old greenhouse behind the house where glass panes had cracked under years of snow. His mother had once grown herbs there, vegetables too stubborn to die, and flowers bright enough to make the cold look foolish. Now the greenhouse stood quiet, its frame bowed, its door hanging slightly off-center. Like everything else on the property, it had survived. That did not mean it was alive. Caleb lifted the hammer again. Ranger went still. Not alert, still. There was a difference. Caleb's body knew it before his mind did. The hammer stopped midair. His shoulders tightened, but his breathing stayed slow. He followed Ranger's line of sight toward the dirt road. At the far end, near the gate, someone stood beneath the pines. A woman. She did not wave. She did not call out. She simply stood there with one hand gripping the handle of an old suitcase and the other resting on the curve of her belly. Pregnant. Caleb lowered the hammer. The woman took one step closer, then stopped as Ranger moved forward. The dog's head lowered slightly. His eyes locked on her. He did not growl, but the warning was there, deep in the angle of his body. Caleb walked toward the gate, slow and measured. The woman was about 30, though exhaustion had placed older shadows beneath her eyes. She was slender in the way of someone who had missed too many meals but refused to bend. Her skin was pale from cold and travel. Her dark brown hair was tied low, loose strands pulled free by the wind. She wore a simple earth-tone dress beneath a thin gray-green coat that was too light for the weather. Her shoes were worn at the soles, dust and mud clinging to the edges. The suitcase in her hand was old brown leather, cracked at the corners, like it had carried more than clothes. Her face was not soft exactly. It was tired. But her eyes, warm brown, steady, guarded, did not beg. Caleb stopped on the inside of the gate. Ranger stood half a step ahead of him. "You lost?" Caleb asked. The woman looked past him once, toward the house, then back to his face. "No." Her voice was quiet. Not weak, just used carefully. Caleb waited. "My name is Elena Vale," she said. "I can work." The wind moved through the pines. Somewhere behind the house, loose metal tapped against wood. Caleb said nothing. Elena tightened her hand over the suitcase handle. "I know plants, greenhouses, soil. I can cook, clean, mend things if they're simple enough." Her hand moved once across her belly, not dramatic, not pleading, protective. "I just need somewhere to stay for a little while." Ranger took one step closer. Caleb lifted 2 fingers, barely a command. The dog stopped. Elena noticed that. Her eyes flicked to Ranger, then back to Caleb. "Please," she said at last. That word landed harder than the others. Not because it was desperate, because it sounded like she hated needing it. Caleb looked at the road behind her. Empty. No car, no second set of footsteps. No fresh tire tracks except old ones cut deep in the thawing mud. "How far did you walk?" Elena hesitated. "Far enough." "That's not an answer." "No," she said. "It isn't." A bitter little smile almost touched Caleb's mouth. Almost. Ranger moved again, but this time not toward her face. He lowered his nose toward the air near her suitcase. His ears shifted. He inhaled slowly, reading what humans could not. Cold sweat, old fear, road dust, dried lavender, leather, pregnancy, hunger. Then he did something Caleb did not expect. He turned his head toward the old greenhouse. Not the house. The greenhouse. Caleb felt something tighten behind his ribs. Ranger stared at the broken glass structure as if someone had called his name from inside it. For a moment, Caleb was no longer standing at the gate. He was a boy again, watching his mother kneel in that greenhouse with dirt on her hands and sunlight in her gray hair. She used to say wounded things did not need pity. They needed soil, water, and someone patient enough not to dig them up every morning to see if they had healed. Caleb had hated that saying as a boy. He hated it more now, because it had the nerve to return when a pregnant stranger stood at his gate. Elena followed Ranger's gaze. "Is that yours?" "It used to be." "A greenhouse?" "Used to be that too." She looked at the sagging frame, the broken panes, the dead vines twisting along one wall. Most people would have seen ruin. Something in Elena's face changed. Not hope exactly, recognition. "I can fix part of it," she said. "Not all, not fast, but enough to keep seedlings alive." Caleb studied her. He had spent years learning when people lied. The eyes often worked too hard. The hands moved wrong. The voice ran ahead of the body. Elena did none of that. But truth was not the same as safety, and Caleb had once paid dearly for forgetting the difference. His jaw tightened. In another life, He had let a stranger through a checkpoint because the man looked harmless. A child had been standing nearby. A woman had cried. There had been dust, heat, and the small human weakness of wanting one moment to be simple. The moment had not been simple. Men died when Caleb trusted too quickly. That memory had followed him home, crossed oceans, and settled into the corners of this house like ash. He looked at Elena's belly again. The child moved, small, visible beneath the fabric. Elena pressed her hand there, her expression flickering for half a second. Pain, fear, tenderness, then gone. Caleb's fingers tightened around the hammer. He could send her away. That would be clean, safe, simple. The kind of decision a man could explain to himself while eating alone at a table built for more than one person. Ranger stepped back from the gate. Not much, just enough to leave space. Caleb looked down at him. The dog did not look at Caleb. He kept watching Elena, but the tension had shifted from threat to judgment. As if Ranger were saying very clearly, "Well?" Caleb let out a slow breath. "You don't come into the house." Elena blinked once. "The greenhouse out back has a dry corner," he continued. "There's a cot in the storage shed if mice haven't promoted themselves to ownership. You stay there tonight." She swallowed. "Thank you. I'm not done." She went still. 3 days, Caleb said. "You stay 3 days. You work if you can. You don't touch locked doors. You don't lie to me. You don't bring trouble to my gate." Something crossed her face at that last sentence. Too fast for most men to see. Caleb saw it. Ranger saw it too. Elena looked down, then back up. "Trouble may already know my name." The words were quiet, but they changed the air. Caleb's eyes narrowed. There it was. Not the full truth, just the shadow of it. The forest seemed to lean closer. Even the wind thinned between the pines. Caleb waited for more, but Elena gave him nothing else. Maybe she had no strength left. Maybe trust, for her, was also a locked door. Ranger moved to the gate and sniffed the ground near her shoes. Then he stepped aside. Not welcoming, allowing. Caleb reached for the latch. The metal was cold beneath his fingers. For one strange second, he thought of all the times that gate had stayed shut. Against neighbors. Against memories. Against Marla's absence. Against the old laughter that used to live in the house before it packed its bags and left without asking his permission. The latch lifted with a dull click. Elena did not rush through. She stood there as if crossing that threshold required more courage than walking all those miles. Caleb opened the gate wide enough for her to pass. Ranger watched her suitcase as it bumped over the muddy ground. Elena took 3 steps inside, then stopped. "Mr. Rourke?" He had not told her his name. Caleb's grip tightened on the gate. Ranger's ears snapped forward. Elena saw the change in him and lifted one hand, slowly. "There's an old mailbox at the road. The name is still painted on it." Caleb stared at her for a long second. Then his eyes moved past her, toward the road. The mailbox leaned near the ditch, half hidden by weeds, its white letters fading, but still visible. Rourke. He looked back at Elena. She did not look away. "All right," he said, though his voice had gone colder. "Greenhouse is behind the house." Elena nodded. As she walked past him, Caleb caught the faint scent of lavender from the old suitcase. Not perfume, dried herbs. Something stored carefully, carried deliberately. Ranger followed at a distance of 3 steps. Caleb closed the gate behind them. The sound echoed across the yard with more finality than it should have. The greenhouse waited behind the house, broken but upright. Sunlight fell through the cracked roof in pale gold stripes. Dust moved in the air. Old planting tables stood along the walls. Empty clay pots sat stacked in a corner. A rusted watering can leaned near the door like a tired little sentinel. Elena stepped inside and set her suitcase down. For the first time, her shoulders lowered, only slightly. But Caleb saw it. He stood outside the doorway. He would not cross in after her. Not yet. "There's a pump near the shed," he said. "Water runs if the pipe hasn't frozen again. Firewood stacked under the tarp. Don't burn the greenhouse down. It's ugly. But it's mine." Elena looked around at the broken glass and dead soil. A small, impossible softness touched her face. "I won't." Ranger walked to the center of the greenhouse, sniffed once, then sat between Elena and the door. Caleb almost smiled. Almost. "Ranger decides before I do," he said. Elena looked at the dog. "That seems fair." Ranger blinked slowly, unimpressed by fairness. Caleb turned to leave, then stopped. Behind him, Elena had opened the suitcase. He did not mean to look, but he did. Inside were not many clothes. A folded blanket, a small tin box, a worn book, and several paper packets tied with string. Seeds. Elena touched them with the care some people reserved for photographs of the dead. Caleb felt the old greenhouse change around him. Not physically, not yet. But in the quiet way a grave might change when someone plants flowers there. He said nothing more. He walked back toward the fence line, hammer still in hand, boots sinking into thawed earth. Behind him, Ranger remained in the greenhouse with the stranger. That bothered Caleb. It comforted him too, and that was worse. By dusk, the cold returned. Caleb stood on the back porch with an old wool blanket under one arm. He told himself it was because she was pregnant, because leaving someone to freeze was stupid, because his mother would haunt him with a wooden spoon if he did otherwise. He did not tell himself the other truth, that when Elena Vale stood at his gate, the silence around the house had shifted. Not broken. Shifted. As if something far away had placed one careful hand on the old property and whispered, "Not finished yet." Caleb walked to the greenhouse and stopped at the door. Elena was sitting on the cot she had dragged from the shed. Her coat was wrapped around her shoulders. Ranger lay near the entrance, head raised, eyes open. Caleb held out the blanket. 3 days, he said. Elena took it with both hands. 3 days, she repeated. The wind moved through the cracked panes above them, and for the first time in years, Caleb roared. Rourke did not know whether opening a gate had been a mistake, or the first right thing he had done in a very long time. The door did not open with ceremony. It shifted inward with a slow, reluctant creak, as if the hinges themselves had grown used to being left alone. The sound traveled through the quiet yard and into the greenhouse behind, where Elena Vale stood with her hands still stained with soil. She did not move right away. From where she stood, she could see Caleb Rourke only as a figure in the doorway of the log house, tall, still, one hand resting lightly against the frame, as if he had not yet decided whether that space belonged to him or to the past. Ranger stood between them. The German shepherd's posture had changed since the first day. He no longer blocked Elena's path outright, but neither did he welcome her. His body angled slightly across the invisible line between the greenhouse and the house, a living boundary drawn in muscle and instinct. Caleb didn't call her in. He simply stepped aside. That was all. Elena understood the language of small permissions. She wiped her hands slowly on the edge of her dress, picked up her worn leather suitcase, and walked toward the house. Her boots left shallow impressions in the thawed earth. Each step measured, not hesitant, careful. As she passed Ranger, the dog turned his head just enough to watch her. Close now, she could see the depth of his eyes. Not wild, not cruel, but precise. He wasn't looking at her the way a pet looked at a person. He was evaluating her. Elena met that gaze for half a second, then lowered her eyes, not out of submission, but respect. Ranger allowed her to pass. Inside, the air felt different. Not stale, but unused. Like a room that had been lived in once, and then slowly abandoned in small, quiet ways. The scent of old wood lingered, mixed with cold iron, dust, and something faintly bitter, like coffee left too long on heat. The kitchen stood to the left. A chipped ceramic mug sat near the edge of the table, ringed by a faint stain. A toolbox lay open beside it, screws and nails scattered among a folded piece of paper that had yellowed at the edges. A jacket hung half off the back of a chair, one sleeve brushing the floor. Nothing was truly dirty, but nothing had been cared for. Caleb moved past her without speaking, stepping toward the sink. He turned the faucet, letting the water run for a moment before washing his hands. The gesture was automatic, practiced. The kind of habit that belonged to someone who had spent years in environments where cleanliness meant survival. Elena set her suitcase down by the wall. She didn't ask where anything went, didn't comment on the house. Her eyes moved across the space, taking in the details quietly, like someone mapping unfamiliar terrain. Ranger entered last. He walked a slow circle through the room, nose low, checking every corner, every surface, every shift in scent. When he passed Elena again, he paused briefly beside her, then continued on. Still deciding. Caleb dried his hands on a cloth that hung from a nail. "You eat what's here," he said without turning. "Not much variety." Elena nodded. "That's fine. There's wood stacked outside. Fire dies, you build it again." "I can do that." He finally glanced at her, briefly. "I'm not running a boarding house." "I know." A beat of silence. "I don't need one," she added. Something in that answer held. Not pride exactly, not defiance, just truth. Caleb studied her for another moment, then gave a short nod, as if closing a file in his mind. That was enough. By late afternoon, the house had begun to shift. Not in large ways, small ones. Elena started with the mug. She picked it up, ran water over it, scrubbed the inside carefully, then set it upside down on a cloth to dry. From there, she moved to the table, not clearing it entirely, just grouping the tools, aligning them so they could be found again. She worked quietly, not rearranging the space, working with it. Ranger watched from the doorway. At one point, he stood and moved closer, stopping just behind her. His presence was unmistakable, close enough that she could feel the warmth of him, the weight of his attention. Elena didn't turn. She continued wiping the table, her movement steady. After a long moment, Ranger lowered himself to the floor, not relaxed, but no longer ready to intervene. Outside, Caleb repaired the last section of fence before the light began to fade. His movement slowed as he noticed something unfamiliar drifting from the open kitchen window. The smell. Onions. Garlic. Something earthy. Potatoes, maybe. A faint hint of dried herbs, warm and subtle. Food that had been cooked, not just prepared. He stood still for a second, the hammer hanging loose in his hand. The house had not smelled like that in a long time. They ate in silence. Elena placed 2 plates on the table without comment. The portions were modest. There hadn't been much to work with. But the food was hot, and the scent carried a kind of quiet comfort. Caleb sat across from her. Ranger positioned himself slightly to the side, close enough to observe both of them. Caleb took a bite, chewed, swallowed. "Little heavy on the salt," he said. Elena looked up. "I'll fix that next time." He nodded once and continued eating. That was the longest conversation they had that evening. Later that night, something shifted. It was subtle at first. A sound. Not loud enough to wake a man, but enough for a dog. Ranger's head lifted from the floor, his ears angled forward, his body going still in a way that had nothing to do with sleep or rest. His eyes moved toward the hallway, then toward the back of the house, toward the room at the end, the one that stayed closed. Ranger stood. He did not bark. He walked slowly down the hallway, each step deliberate, controlled. Elena, half awake on the couch, noticed the movement. "Ranger?" she whispered. The dog didn't respond. At the end of the hall, he stopped in front of the closed door. He stared at it, longer than necessary. Then, very slowly, he sat down and waited. No scratching, no growling, just waiting. In the other room, Caleb opened his eyes. He didn't move immediately. He knew that posture. Ranger only did that when something felt familiar, not dangerous, not safe. Something else. Caleb sat up in the darkness, his jaw tightening slightly. For a moment, neither man nor dog moved. The house held its breath. Then Ranger stood again, turned, and walked back to the living room, as if nothing had happened. He lay down near Elena, but he did not sleep, and neither did Caleb. Morning came quietly. The light slipped through the windows in thin lines, pale and clean. The forest outside had softened under a new layer of frost, but the air inside the house felt different, warmer. Caleb stepped into the kitchen, expecting the same stillness he had lived with for years. Instead, he found Elena standing at the stove. Her back was to him, her movements slow and careful. A small pot simmered gently. Coffee sat already poured into a mug, steam rising in thin curls. Ranger lay near the doorway, watching her, not with suspicion this time, with attention. Caleb washed his hands again, the habit unchanged. When he turned back, the mug was waiting for him on the table. He sat, took a sip. The coffee was strong, clean. He didn't say anything, but he didn't leave either. The changes stayed small. Elena didn't ask where things belonged. She learned by watching. A towel folded instead of left hanging. Tools returned to the same place after use. A window opened just enough to let the air move through the house. Ranger followed her more closely now. Not touching, not guarding, just there. Sometimes he walked ahead of her, checking the space before she entered. Other times he sat nearby, watching her hands as she worked, as if memorizing a pattern he might need later. Caleb noticed everything. He said very little. But he came inside earlier each day. That afternoon, Elena moved down the hallway. She hadn't gone there before. Not fully. The door at the end of the hall stood slightly ajar now. Ranger stopped beside her. He didn't block her. He didn't move ahead. He simply stood there, waiting. Elena placed her hand on the door. For a moment, she considered leaving it alone. Some things did not need to be opened. But the house had already begun to change, and change did not stop at closed doors. She pushed it open. Inside, the room was dim. Dust lay across the surfaces, untouched. A small table stood near the wall. A frame rested face down on it. The air carried the faint scent of old wood. And something else. Something unfinished. Elena stepped inside slowly. Ranger remained at the threshold, watching, not entering. Behind her, in the hallway, Caleb stood. He hadn't meant to follow, but he had. And now he watched her stand in that room, where time had stopped years ago. For a second, something tightened in his chest. Not anger, not fear. Recognition. Elena turned slightly, sensing him there. Neither of them spoke. The house seemed to hold that silence between them, stretching it thin, testing whether it would break. It didn't. Not yet. The room at the end of the hallway did not welcome anyone. It held its silence like something deliberate, not accidental. Dust had settled evenly across the wooden surfaces, untouched for years. The air carried the faint scent of old pine, and something softer beneath it. A trace of time that had not moved forward, only stopped. Elena Vale stood just inside the doorway. She did not step fully into the room at first. Behind her, Caleb Rourke remained in the hallway, his broad frame filling the narrow space without effort. He did not cross the threshold, not yet. Not ever, unless he had to. Ranger stood beside him. The German shepherd's posture was different again. Not tense, not relaxed. Focused. His ears were angled slightly forward, his eyes fixed on the interior of the room as if reading something written in scent and silence. He did not enter either, 3 of them, and the space between them felt measured. Elena moved 1 step forward. The floor creaked beneath her weight, a small sound, but in that room, it carried. On the table, the picture frame still lay face down. She didn't reach for it immediately. Instead, her eyes moved slowly around the room. There was a bed frame pushed against the wall, bare except for a folded blanket stiff with time. A narrow window allowed a strip of pale light to fall across the floor, catching dust in its path. In the corner stood a small wooden chair, handmade, uneven in places, but carefully built. Too carefully. Not for decoration, for use. But it had never been used. Elena's gaze lingered there longer than necessary. She understood what it meant, without needing to ask. Some objects carried their purpose even when they were never fulfilled. She stepped closer to the table. Behind her, Caleb shifted his weight slightly. It was the only sign he gave. Elena placed her fingers lightly on the edge of the frame and turned it over. The photograph revealed itself in silence. Caleb stood beside a woman, younger, cleaner, untouched by the years that had followed. His posture in the photo was different. Not softer, but open. The woman beside him leaned into his shoulder with a natural ease, her smile wide and unguarded. She was in her early 40s now, but in that image, she looked like someone who believed in the future as something stable. Elena studied it for a moment. Not too long. Then she placed it back exactly the way she had found it. Face down. She didn't ask. That was the choice she made. And that choice mattered more than any question. Later that evening, they sat outside on the porch. The forest had quieted into that deep, breathing stillness that came just after sunset. The pine trees stood tall against the fading sky, their silhouettes soft but immovable. The air was cold enough to remind the body it was still early in the season, but not harsh enough to push anyone back inside. Caleb leaned against the wooden railing, one hand resting loosely on the surface. Elena sat a few feet away, wrapped in the wool blanket he had given her. Her posture was relaxed, but not careless. One hand rested over her belly, fingers moving slightly from time to time, as if responding to something only she could feel. Ranger lay between them, not directly touching either, but close enough to both. His head rested near Elena's boot, his eyes half closed, though anyone who knew working dogs would recognize the truth. He was not sleeping. He never truly slept when he was responsible for a space. The silence stretched. Not uncomfortable, just unfilled. "I built that chair," Caleb said suddenly. Elena didn't turn immediately. Her gaze stayed on the tree line for another second before she shifted slightly toward him. "I thought so," she replied. His mouth twitched faintly. "That obvious?" "No," she said. Too careful not to be. Caleb let out a slow breath through his nose. It was supposed to be for a kid, he said. The words came out without hesitation. That surprised him. He hadn't planned to say them. He hadn't planned to say anything. But the quiet did something to people. It made certain truths feel less like confessions and more like facts. Elena nodded once. She didn't say, "I'm sorry." She didn't say what happened. She didn't offer comfort that hadn't been asked for. That, more than anything, made it easier to continue. "We thought we'd stay here," Caleb said. "Fix things up. Make it something." He glanced toward the house. Turns out something means different things to different people. Elena turned her head slightly, watching him now. "What did it mean to you?" she asked. Caleb didn't answer right away. His eyes moved across the trees, tracing lines that only he could see. "Quiet," he said finally. "Simple, honest work. Enough space that the past doesn't crowd you." "And to her?" He gave a small shrug. "Not that." There was no bitterness in his voice. That was the strange part. Not anger. Not even regret. Just absence. Elena let the silence return. After a moment, she spoke again. "Sometimes," she said slowly, "people don't leave because something is wrong." Caleb looked at her. "They leave because staying would make them disappear." The words settled between them like something fragile. Caleb studied her more closely now. There was weight behind that sentence. Not theory. Experience. "What about you?" he asked. Elena's fingers tightened slightly over her belly. Her eyes dropped for a moment, then lifted again. "Sometimes," she said quietly, "you leave before someone decides for you that you don't get to choose anymore." Caleb held her gaze. There it was. Not the full story, but enough to understand the direction it pointed. Ranger shifted slightly, adjusting his position so that his body angled more toward Elena than before. Not protectively, not yet, but closer. A sudden movement broke the stillness. Ranger's head snapped up, not toward the road, not toward the forest, behind them, the house. The dog stood instantly, his body tightening, his gaze fixed on the porch door. Caleb straightened. "What is it?" he asked, already alert. Ranger took 2 steps toward the door, then stopped. His ears twitched, his nose lifted slightly. He inhaled. Once, twice. Then his posture changed. Not into aggression, not into alarm, recognition. He moved to the door and pressed his nose lightly against the wood, just below the handle. Caleb's eyes narrowed. "That's not outside," he murmured. Elena rose slowly from her seat, her movements cautious. "What does that mean?" Caleb didn't answer. He stepped forward, opened the door, and entered the house. Ranger moved ahead of him this time, crossing the threshold first. They followed the dog down the hallway. The air inside felt still, unchanged, and yet something about it felt disturbed. Ranger stopped halfway down the hall. Then he turned his head toward Caleb. Not waiting for a command, not asking permission, just looking. Caleb's jaw tightened. He knew that look. It meant, this matters. They reached the end of the hallway. The door to the room stood exactly as they had left it, closed. Caleb reached for the handle. For a brief second, his hand hovered there. Then he opened it. The room was unchanged. The chair remained in the corner. The table stood still. The photograph lay face down. Nothing moved. Nothing had been touched. Ranger stepped inside. Slowly. He walked to the chair, sat down beside it, and rested his head lightly against the wooden seat. Caleb stared. For a long moment, no one spoke. Elena stood behind him, her breath shallow. "What is he doing?" she whispered. Caleb didn't answer, because he didn't know. But something about the way Ranger held himself, not alert, not guarding, just present, felt deliberate, as if the dog had decided something, and whatever it wasn't about danger. Later that night, the house settled again, but it was not the same silence as before. Something had shifted, not broken, shifted. Caleb sat at the kitchen table long after Elena had gone to rest. Ranger lay near the hallway, facing both directions, always watching. Caleb leaned forward, his forearms resting on the table, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. The memory of the chair, the room, the dog's reaction, it all moved through his mind without forming into something clear. He didn't believe in signs. He didn't believe in things that couldn't be explained. But he did believe in patterns. And Ranger had never reacted without reason. Caleb exhaled slowly. Across the room, the mug Elena had washed earlier sat drying on the counter. Small things. That's how change started. Not loud, not dramatic, just present. In the early hours before dawn, Elena woke. The house was quiet. Too quiet for someone still getting used to it. She sat up slowly, her hand instinctively moving to her belly. The baby shifted. Alive. Steady. She listened. No footsteps, no voices, just the faint creak of wood adjusting to the cold. She lay back down, closed her eyes, and for the first time in weeks, she did not wake up again. Spring did not arrive all at once. It moved through the forest slowly, like breath returning to a body that had forgotten what warmth felt like. Snow withdrew into the shadows beneath the pines. The ground softened, dark and rich, and small green shoots began pushing through soil that had once seemed finished. Behind the house, the greenhouse no longer looked abandoned. It wasn't restored, not fully, but it was no longer dead. Several panes had been patched with salvaged glass and plastic sheeting. Inside, rows of shallow trays held dark soil, and from that soil, thin lines of green had begun to rise. Fragile, quiet, alive. Elena Vale knelt inside, her hands deep in the earth. Her sleeves were rolled back, revealing wrists marked faintly with older bruises that had yellowed into memory. Her movements were steady, deliberate, her breathing slow. The kind of calm that didn't come from peace, but from learning how to survive without it. A small tin container sat beside her, open. Inside were carefully folded packets, seeds she had carried across miles of road and fear. She handled them like something sacred, not because they were rare, but because they were all she had chosen to keep. Outside, Caleb worked on the fence again. He could have finished it days ago. But work like that had a way of stretching when a man needed something to hold on to. Ranger moved between the house and the greenhouse in slow, looping patterns. Not restless, not bored, monitoring. He paused near the greenhouse door, watching Elena. His posture had shifted again. The edge of suspicion had dulled. What remained was attention. He listened for her footsteps. He watched her hands. He had begun to memorize her. Caleb noticed that too. He didn't comment on it. He didn't comment on much these days. But he found himself walking back toward the house earlier than before. Sitting at the table without reason, listening to the sounds inside. The quiet clink of dishes, the soft rhythm of movement, the presence of another human being who did not fill space with noise. It unsettled him, and it steadied him, both at the same time. The sound of the engine came just past midday. It cut through the quiet like something that didn't belong. Ranger froze first. His head snapped toward the road, ears forward, body tightening into that familiar, coiled stillness. His tail lowered slightly. Not fear, not aggression. Focus. Caleb set the hammer down without a word. He was already moving by the time the dust from the road began to rise. The vehicle came into view, a dark SUV, too clean for the dirt road, its engine still running even as it slowed near the gate. It didn't belong to the forest. It didn't belong to this place. It belonged to somewhere else. The driver's door opened. The woman who stepped out carried the past with her. Marla Rourke. She was in her early 40s now, but she held herself with the same composed posture Caleb remembered. Her figure was lean, refined, shaped by a life that had moved forward while his had stayed still. Her blonde hair was pulled back neatly, not a strand out of place. Her skin held the softness of someone who had not spent years under weather and labor. Her coat, long, beige, tailored, did not belong to the mud beneath her boots. But her eyes were different. There was something unsettled in them now, something that hadn't been there before. "Caleb," she called out, her voice carrying across the yard. He didn't answer. He stopped just inside the gate, his hands resting loosely at his sides, his expression unreadable. Ranger moved ahead of him, positioning himself between the gate and the house. Marla's gaze dropped briefly to the dog. "I remember him," she said softly. "He remembers you too," Caleb replied. It wasn't warmth. It wasn't hostility. It was something in between. Something finished. Elena stepped out of the greenhouse. She hadn't meant to listen, but the sound of the engine had pulled her attention like a thread being drawn tight. From where she stood, she could see them both. Caleb near the gate, the woman just outside it. The distance between them felt heavy. She didn't step closer. Not yet. "I shouldn't have left like that," Marla said. The words came too quickly, as if she had rehearsed them. Caleb's jaw tightened slightly. "That's not why you're here." It wasn't a question. Marla hesitated. For a moment, the version of her that Caleb had known, the one who smiled easily, who believed in futures, seemed to flicker beneath the surface. Then it was gone. "There's a development project moving through this area," she said. "A resort. Private land acquisition, phased build." Caleb's eyes didn't move. "Your land is on their list." The wind shifted. Pine branches whispered overhead. Caleb let out a slow breath. "And you came all this way to warn me?" Marla shook her head. "I came because I didn't know it was your land until it was already in motion." That answer carried truth. Not enough to fix anything, but enough to matter. Elena took a step forward. Just one. And that was when Marla saw her. Everything stopped. Marla's gaze moved from Elena's face to her belly, then back again. The silence changed shape. "Who is she?" Marla asked. No one answered. The question wasn't really a question. It was an accusation waiting to take form. Marla took a step closer to the gate. "Caleb?" she said, her voice tightening slightly. "What is this?" Elena didn't speak. She stood still, her hands resting lightly at her sides, her posture steady. Not defensive, not apologetic, present. Marla let out a short, breathless laugh. "Of course," she said quietly. "Of course." Caleb's expression hardened. "That's not what this is." "No?" Marla's eyes sharpened. "Because it looks like you didn't waste much time." The words landed. Sharp, unfair. Caleb didn't react immediately. He rarely did. But Elena felt something shift inside her. Not anger, not shame, recognition. She had seen this before. The way a situation could be twisted into something else entirely. the way truth could be reshaped by fear and assumption. She stepped forward. "I'm just staying here," she said calmly. "Working, that's all." Marla looked at her again, longer this time, taking in the worn coat, the dirt-stained hands, the quiet strength in her posture. Then her gaze dropped once more to Elena's belly. "Then leave," Marla said. The word came clean, cold. "This isn't your place." The forest seemed to draw in around them. Elena stood there for a moment. Then she nodded once, not in agreement, in acceptance. She turned, walked back toward the greenhouse, and didn't stop. Ranger moved before anyone else. He ran past Caleb, past the gate, past the line that separated outside from inside. He reached Elena just as she bent to pick up her suitcase. The dog grabbed the strap in his mouth and held, not pulling, not aggressive, just holding. Elena looked down at him. "Ranger," she said softly. He didn't let go. Behind them, Caleb froze. That wasn't training, that wasn't command, that was choice. Ranger had never disobeyed a boundary before, not like this, not without instruction. The strap of the suitcase stretched slightly under the tension. Elena's grip tightened. For a second, it looked like she might pull it free. But she didn't. She just stood there, breathing, thinking, waiting. Caleb reached them a moment later. "Let go," he said quietly. Ranger didn't move. Caleb's voice didn't rise. "Ranger." The dog's ears flicked, but his jaw remained locked. Caleb stared at him. Something passed between them, silent, direct, understood in a way words never managed. Then Caleb exhaled. Not frustration, not anger, recognition. He looked at Elena. "She doesn't leave," he said. Elena blinked. "That's not your decision," she replied. "No," Caleb said. "It's yours." A pause. "But you don't make it like this?" Elena's fingers tightened around the suitcase handle. "I don't want trouble here." Caleb nodded once. "You don't bring it. It's already here." The truth of that settled heavily between them. Elena looked at Ranger. The dog's eyes met hers, steady, unwavering, as if asking a question only she could answer. After a long moment, she let out a quiet breath. "All right," she said. Ranger released the strap immediately. Marla stood by the gate, watching. The scene had shifted without her control. And that unsettled her more than anything else. "You're really letting her stay?" she asked. Caleb didn't look back at her. "This place stopped being yours the day you left," he said. The words were not loud, but they were final. Marla flinched, just slightly. She opened her mouth to speak, then stopped. Whatever she had come to say, it didn't fit anymore. Not here. Not now. She stepped back slowly, returned to the car. The engine started. Dust rose again as she drove away. This time, no one watched her go. The yard settled. The forest resumed its quiet. But something had changed. Elena placed the suitcase back near the greenhouse wall. She didn't unpack. Not yet. Caleb stood a few feet away, his hands resting loosely at his sides. Ranger returned to his usual position, between them, watching both, neither guarding, neither retreating, just present. That evening, the house felt different again. Not warmer, not lighter, but steadier, as if something had been tested and held. Caleb sat at the table, staring at nothing in particular. Elena moved quietly through the kitchen, preparing what little food they had. Neither of them spoke, not because there was nothing to say, but because some things needed time to settle into shape. Outside, the wind moved through the pines. Inside, the house listened. And somewhere between silence and decision, something had chosen to stay. The days after Marla left did not return to normal. They moved forward instead, quietly, without asking permission. Spring settled deeper into the forest, softening the ground until footsteps no longer echoed but sank. The greenhouse held more green than brown now. Small leaves unfolded toward light that filtered through patched glass, fragile and stubborn in equal measure. Inside the house, something else had begun to change. Not loudly, not dramatically, but in the kind of way that could not be undone once it started. Caleb Rourke opened the door to the room at the end of the hallway before sunrise. He didn't hesitate this time. The air inside was still cold, but the dust had already begun to thin from the days before. The faint imprint of Elena's presence, of movement, of breath, had unsettled the stillness enough that it no longer felt untouched. He stepped inside. The floor creaked beneath his boots, familiar now instead of distant. Caleb moved directly to the window. He pushed it open. The hinges protested, then gave way. Cold air spilled in, carrying the scent of pine and wet soil. It moved through the room, shifting the dust into motion, breaking the long-held stillness into something alive. Caleb stood there for a moment. Then he went to work. He didn't say anything about it to Elena. He didn't explain. He simply started. By mid-morning, the room had begun to take shape. The bed frame had been reinforced, the joints tightened, the wood checked for weakness. The small chair in the corner remained where it was. But now it had been wiped clean, its surface free of dust, the grain of the wood visible again. Not perfect, but ready. Caleb worked in measured silence. Every movement had intent. Every decision was deliberate. From the doorway, Elena watched. She had not meant to, but she found herself pausing there more often than not, her hand resting lightly against the frame, her body angled just enough to see without intruding. Caleb didn't acknowledge her, not directly, but he didn't close the door either. That was his way of allowing her to witness without asking. Elena's eyes moved across the room, to the bed, to the window, to the chair, and then to Caleb. There was something different in him. Not softer, not yet, but less distant, as if the space between who he had been and who he might become had begun to narrow. She said nothing, because she understood something about men like him. Words didn't change them. Time did, and choices. Later that afternoon, Caleb moved out to the storage shed behind the greenhouse. The structure leaned slightly to one side, its wood darkened with age, its door stiff from disuse. He pulled it open with a firm tug, the hinges groaning under the motion. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of old wood, oil, and time. Tools lay scattered across a workbench. Coils of rope hung from nails. A tarp covered something large in the back corner, its shape softened by dust. Caleb stepped inside. Ranger followed. The German shepherd's nose moved immediately, tracing scents layered over years. Old metal, dried earth, faint traces of human presence that had long since faded. Caleb reached the tarp. For a moment his hand rested on it. Then he pulled it back. The cradle revealed itself slowly, wooden, handmade. Not perfect in its lines, but solid. Built by someone who understood the importance of strength over appearance. The edges were worn smooth, not from use, but from careful handling. The kind of care that came from intention rather than habit. Caleb stood still. Ranger sat beside him, silent. Present, the memory came without warning. His father's hands, rough and steady, guiding the wood into place. The quiet pride in the older man's eyes when he had stepped back to look at it. "You build things like they'll matter," his father had said. Caleb hadn't understood then. He did now. He reached out, brushing his hand across the surface of the cradle. Dust lifted beneath his touch, revealing the grain beneath. Years had passed, but the wood had held. He lifted it carefully, not because it was fragile, but because it deserved to be. As Caleb carried the cradle out into the light, Ranger stopped suddenly. The dog's head turned toward the edge of the forest. Not the road, not the house, the trees. His ears rose, sharp and focused. Caleb followed his gaze. Nothing moved. No sound, no figure, just the stillness of the woods. But Ranger didn't relax. He stepped forward, positioning himself between Caleb and the tree line. Low stance, silent, alert, Caleb set the cradle down slowly. His eyes scanned the forest. Years of training sharpened his perception. Subtle shifts in shadow, unnatural stillness, the absence of expected sound. For a brief moment, the forest felt wrong. Not dangerous, but aware. Then, just as quickly, the tension faded. A bird broke from a branch overhead, wings cutting through the silence. Ranger's posture eased. He exhaled. The moment passed, but something lingered. Caleb glanced once more at the trees, then back at the cradle. He didn't say anything, but he remembered it. By evening, the cradle stood inside the room at the end of the hallway. Cleaned, repaired, set near the window where light could reach it. Elena stood in the doorway again. Her eyes lingered on the cradle longer than anything else. She didn't ask where it came from. She didn't ask why now. She simply stepped inside and placed her hand lightly against the edge of it. The wood was cool, solid, real. A small breath left her chest. Not relief. Not quite. Something closer to recognition. She turned to Caleb. "This was yours?" she asked quietly. He shook his head once. "My father's," he said. A pause. "I never used it." The weight of that settled into the room. Elena nodded. She didn't offer comfort. She didn't offer sympathy. She understood that neither would help. Instead, she stepped back and let the space hold what it needed to hold. The night the baby came, the rain was soft. It fell steadily against the roof, a quiet rhythm that wrapped the house in sound. The forest absorbed most of it, leaving only a muted echo that carried through the walls. Elena woke first. Her breath hitched. Her hand gripped the edge of the bed. The pain came in waves, controlled, measured, but undeniable. Ranger heard it before Caleb did. The dog's head lifted instantly. He stood, moving to the side of the bed, his body tense but not panicked. A single sound escaped him, short, sharp, enough. Caleb was awake before the second breath. He moved without hesitation. "Now?" he asked. Elena nodded once, her jaw tight. "Now." There was no panic, no wasted motion. Caleb grabbed the keys, the jacket, the essentials he had not consciously prepared but somehow knew where to find. Ranger followed. Always. The truck roared to life in the dark, tires biting into the wet ground as they pulled onto the road. No words were spoken. They didn't need them. The hospital lights were harsh, clean, unforgiving. Time stretched inside those walls. Minutes became something else. Caleb stood just outside the room, his hands resting at his sides, his posture controlled, but his eyes fixed on the door. Ranger lay against the wall nearby, still, waiting. Then, a cry, sharp, clear, alive. Everything else faded. A nurse stepped out, mid-30s, dark hair pulled into a tight bun, eyes steady from years of long nights and harder moments. Her name badge read, Mara Keene. "It's a boy," she said simply. Caleb exhaled, slow, deep, as if something he had been holding for years had finally been released. Inside, Elena held the child, wrapped in white, small, real. Her expression had changed. Not softer, stronger, as if the world had shifted its weight, and she had chosen to carry it. Caleb stepped closer. His boots felt too loud against the floor. His hands that had held weapons, carried men, built walls, hovered for a moment, then lowered, then rose again. He reached out, took the child, carefully. His arms adjusted instinctively, finding balance, finding support. The baby shifted slightly, letting out a small sound. Caleb froze, not from fear, from awareness. This was not something to control. This was something to hold. "What's his name?" Mara asked. Elena looked at the child, then at Caleb. "Rowan," she said. The name settled into the space like something that had always belonged there. Caleb nodded once. Rowan. A tree that survived winter. A life that chose to stay. He looked down at the child again, and for the first time in a very long time, he did not think about what could be lost. Only what was here. The weeks after Rowan's birth did not move in straight lines. They blurred. Morning arrived before anyone had truly slept. Night fell before the day's small disasters could be counted. A bottle warmed too slowly. A blanket slipped loose. Rowan cried with the full authority of a tiny king, displeased with his kingdom. Caleb Rourke learned quickly that combat training did not prepare a man for a newborn. He could clear a room in darkness, read a tree line for movement, and fix a broken fence in freezing rain. But the first time Rowan cried in his arms, Caleb froze as if someone had handed him a live grenade wrapped in white cotton. Elena, pale but stronger each day, watched him with tired eyes and the smallest smile. "Support his head," she whispered. "I am. You're supporting his entire future. Try just the head." For half a second, something almost like laughter moved across Caleb's face. Ranger lay beside the cradle, his black and tan body curled in a watchful half-circle. The 6-year-old German Shepherd K9 had accepted his new post with grave professionalism. He did not crowd the baby. He did not lick his face or bark at every cry. He simply lifted his head whenever Rowan stirred, ears forward, eyes focused, as if the child were the most important mission he had ever been given. The house changed around them. Not completely. The old wood still creaked. The wind still pushed against the windows at night. Caleb still woke at sounds no one else noticed. But now there was a cradle near the window. There were clean cloths folded beside the stove. There was Elena's quiet humming in the early morning, soft and low, drifting through the house like a candle flame refusing the dark. And for the first time in years, Caleb stayed inside when the silence grew heavy. He did not always know what to do there, but he stayed. The engine came 3 nights after a hard rain. It was late enough that the forest had folded into itself. Moonlight lay thin over the yard. The pine trees stood black against the sky, and the dirt road was slick in places where water still gathered in shallow ruts. Ranger heard it first. His head rose from beside the cradle. No bark, only stillness. Then came the sound again, an engine slowing too late near the gate. Caleb was already awake. He sat up in the chair near the hallway, one hand reaching instinctively toward the old field jacket draped beside him. Elena stirred near Rowan's cradle. "What is it?" she whispered. Ranger stood. A low vibration built deep in his chest. Not loud, not wild, controlled. Caleb moved toward the window and looked out. Headlights cut across the yard, bright and careless. A truck sat outside the gate, engine running. 3 figures stepped out. One of them moved ahead of the others. Even before Elena saw his face, her body changed. Her shoulders tightened. Her hand went to the cradle. Caleb noticed. "Who is he?" Elena's lips parted, but the answer came from outside. "Elena!" The voice was rough, dragged at the edges by anger and something else. Alcohol, maybe, or the kind of arrogance that did not need a bottle to become dangerous. Elena closed her eyes. "Derek." Derek Sloan was in his late 30s, broad in the chest and heavy through the arms, the kind of man whose strength had softened into bulk, but still made him dangerous up close. His dark hair was cut short but uneven, like grooming was something he remembered only when forced. A rough shadow of beard darkened his jaw. He wore a dark, worn jacket, faded jeans, and heavy boots muddy from the road. His face might once have been handsome in a blunt way, but resentment had tightened it into something hard and hungry. Behind him stood two men, less certain than he was. They hung back near the truck, following because men like Derek often collected weaker souls the way storms collected debris. Derek stepped closer to the gate. "You done hiding?" he called. "Took me long enough to track you down." Elena lifted Rowan carefully. The baby stirred but did not cry. Caleb turned to her. "Stay inside." "No," she said. It surprised him, not because she spoke, because her voice did not shake. "I won't let him think I'm afraid to stand in my own life." Caleb held her gaze for a second, then nodded once. Together, they stepped onto the porch. Ranger went first. The dog moved with no wasted motion, shoulders low, body controlled. His eyes fixed on Derek. Derek saw him and laughed once. "Cute," he said. "You got yourself a guard dog." Caleb descended the porch steps. "Elena already answered whatever question you came to ask." Derek's eyes cut toward him. "And who the hell are you?" Caleb stopped halfway across the yard. "Someone standing between you and a bad decision." The two men behind Derek shifted uneasily. Derek looked past Caleb toward Elena. "You think you can just walk away?" he shouted. "After everything I did for you?" Elena held Rowan close. "You helped me when I needed help," she said. "Then you started using that help like a chain." Derek's face twisted. "That's my child." The word struck the yard hard. Caleb's eyes moved briefly to Elena. She did not look away from Derek. "You don't know that," she said quietly. "And even if you did, that doesn't make me your property." Derek took one step forward, then another. Ranger moved, fast. Not a bite, not yet. A warning shaped like lightning. He lunged and stopped inches from Derek's throat, teeth snapping shut in the air with a sound so sharp the night itself seemed to flinch. Derek froze. Every bit of drunk courage drained from his face. Ranger held position, paws planted, teeth bared now, breath steady. Caleb stepped closer. He did not raise his voice. "She chose." Derek swallowed. His eyes remained locked on Ranger. "You don't know what you're getting into," he muttered. Caleb's face did not change. "I know exactly what men sound like when they mistake control for love." For a moment, no one moved. Then one of the men behind Derek spoke under his breath. "Let's go, man." Derek backed away slowly. His pride tried to stay. His body knew better. The truck doors slammed. The engine roared. Gravel spat under the tires as they pulled away. Ranger did not move until the sound disappeared completely into the trees. Only then did he step back. Elena stood on the porch, shaking now. Not from fear alone, from the terrible exhaustion of being found. Inside, after Rowan had fallen back asleep, Elena sat at the kitchen table with both hands wrapped around a mug she had not touched. Caleb stood near the stove. Ranger lay between the cradle and the door. For a long time, no one spoke. Then Elena reached into the old suitcase. Caleb watched her pull out the small tin box she had carried from the beginning. Her fingers trembled as she opened it. Inside were seed packets, folded papers, and a thin silver hospital bracelet. Not hers. Too small. Elena stared at it for a long moment. Then she said, almost too softly to hear, "There was another baby before Rowan." Caleb went very still. Ranger lifted his head. Elena closed the tin again before Caleb could see the name. "I left before he could make this one disappear too," she said. The words did not explain everything, but they changed everything. Caleb looked toward the cradle, then back at Elena. He understood then that Derek had not come to reclaim love. He had come because someone had escaped the story he wanted to own. And now, there was a child who proved she had survived it. The legal papers arrived 4 days later. A deputy brought them to the gate just after noon. Not sheriff, not friend, just duty. Derek Sloan had filed a claim. He wanted paternity testing. He wanted custody consideration. He accused Elena of instability, flight, and endangering the child. The words were clean on paper. That made them worse. Elena read the first page twice. By the third line of the second page, her face had gone pale. Caleb reached for the papers, but she held them tighter. "No," she said. "I need to read it." So he let her. Because protecting someone did not mean taking every hard thing out of her hands. Sometimes it meant standing beside her while she held it. That afternoon, Caleb drove her into town. The town was small, set between pine-covered slopes and a wide, cold river. Old brick buildings lined the main street. A diner sign flickered even in daylight. A hardware store kept shovels and seed bags stacked by the door. The lawyer's office sat above a closed bookshop. Nolan Pierce opened the door before Caleb knocked. He was 55, tall but slightly stooped in the shoulders, with a lean, weathered frame and a face carved by old discipline. His brown hair had thinned and gone gray at the temples. A trimmed gray beard traced his jaw. He wore a simple brown coat over a blue shirt, dark trousers, and worn leather shoes. His eyes were pale hazel, sharp but not unkind. He looked like a man who had spent half his life reading lies from people's mouths. "Caleb Rourke," he said. Caleb nodded. "Nolan." Elena glanced between them. Nolan noticed. "Used to be a cop," he said. "Now I argue with paper for a living." His voice was dry, practical, without polish. He looked at Elena, then at the bundle in her arms. "And you must be the reason he looks like he hasn't slept since Easter." Elena almost smiled. Almost. Nolan invited them in. The office was small but orderly. 2 filing cabinets, a wooden desk, a pot of coffee that smelled criminal, and a framed badge on the wall facing away from the window. Nolan read the paperwork in silence. His expression did not change. That worried Elena more than if it had. Finally, he set the pages down. "This won't be quick," he said. Elena looked at Rowan. "How bad?" "Bad enough to take seriously. Not bad enough to panic." Caleb leaned forward. "Can you handle it?" Nolan looked at him. "I can help, but I don't work miracles, and I don't work free." Caleb nodded. "Understood." Elena opened her mouth, but Caleb spoke before she could. "We'll pay." Nolan held up a hand. "Not today. Today, we make sure he can't walk into your life and call it his." For the first time since the papers arrived, Elena's shoulders dropped slightly. Only slightly. But enough. The weeks that followed were made of small wars. Phone calls, forms, statements, appointments, waiting. Elena wrote down what she remembered, sometimes stopping mid-sentence because memory had teeth. Caleb drove her into town, sat beside her when needed, waited outside when she asked him to. He never pushed. That was what made him different. Derek had always pushed. Caleb remained. At night, when Elena woke from dreams she would not describe, Caleb no longer escaped to the porch. He stayed in the kitchen, or in the hallway, or near the cradle while Ranger watched the door. One night, Elena found him sitting beside Rowan's cradle, one large hand resting carefully on the wooden edge. He wasn't touching the baby, just near enough. Ranger lay at his feet. Elena stopped in the doorway. Caleb looked up. "I'm not good at this," he said. She knew he meant more than the baby. She stepped inside. "Neither am I." Rowan made a small sound in his sleep. Both of them looked down at once, and for a brief, fragile moment, fear did not leave the room. But it no longer stood there alone. Autumn came quietly. Not as a storm, not as a declaration, but as a slow surrender of green into gold. The forest changed its voice. Leaves softened their hold on branches. The wind moved differently now, carrying the scent of dry pine needles, cold air, and something that felt like time folding into itself. The land around Caleb Rourke's house had settled into a rhythm. The greenhouse stood firm now, no longer patched together in desperation, but maintained with care. Rows of herbs and late-season vegetables filled the narrow beds, their roots deep in soil that had been turned, watered, and believed in again. The fence held. The porch had been repaired. The house no longer felt like it was waiting to be left behind. Inside, Rowan slept in the cradle near the window. The same cradle Caleb had once kept hidden under dust now rocked gently with each small movement of the child. The wood bore new marks now, tiny scratches, faint impressions from use. It was no longer something that had almost mattered. It mattered. Elena moved through the house with quiet confidence. Her strength had returned slowly, not all at once. The pale exhaustion that once clung to her had softened into something steadier. Her posture no longer carried the weight of escape, but the awareness of staying. Her hands, once cautious in unfamiliar spaces, now worked with certainty. She knew where everything belonged. And more importantly, she knew she belonged. Caleb stood in the doorway, watching her. Not in the way a man watches something fragile, in the way a man watches something he trusts not to break. Ranger lay near the cradle. The German shepherd had changed too, not in form. His black and tan coat still clean, his posture still disciplined, his eyes still alert, but in presence. The sharp line between vigilance and rest had softened. He no longer watched Elena like a variable to be assessed. He watched her like a constant, a known, a part of the perimeter. The case ended on a gray morning. There had been no dramatic courtroom moment, no raised voices or final speeches, just paperwork, signatures, and a judge who had seen too many versions of the same story to pretend it was new. Elena held the final document in her hands outside the courthouse. Her fingers didn't shake, but they didn't relax either. Nolan Pierce stood beside her, one hand in the pocket of his brown coat, the other holding a folded file. His weathered face showed no triumph, no relief, only the quiet satisfaction of a job done properly. "You're clear," he said. "No further claim. No shared custody." Elena nodded. "That's it?" she asked. "That's it," Nolan replied. She looked down at the paper again. Freedom did not feel like a moment. It felt like space, a space she hadn't fully stepped into yet. Caleb stood a few feet away, arms crossed loosely, his posture relaxed but attentive. He hadn't spoken during the final proceedings. He hadn't needed to. Now as Elena turned toward him, something passed between them. Not gratitude, not obligation, recognition. Nolan cleared his throat. "You'll still want to keep records," he said. "People like Sloan don't always stay finished." Caleb nodded once. "We will." Nolan looked at Rowan, then back at Elena. "You did right," he said simply. Then he turned and walked away. Marla returned on a day that felt like it belonged to memory. The sky was pale, the air still, the forest quiet in that way that came just before winter remembered how to return. Her car stopped at the gate again, but this time the engine cut immediately. No urgency, no demand. Marla stepped out slowly. She wore the same long beige coat, but it seemed different now. Less like armor, more like something she had put on without thinking. Her hair was tied back loosely. A few strands had escaped, moved by the wind. She looked smaller. Not physically, but in the way certainty leaves a person. Caleb walked to the gate. He did not open it, not yet. Marla stopped a few feet away. "I'm not here to stay," she said. Her voice carried no edge this time, only honesty. Caleb nodded once. "I know." She held something in her hands. A folder. She extended it toward him. "This should help keep the land out of the development contract," she said. "Internal filings. They weren't supposed to be public." Caleb took the folder. Their hands did not touch. "For what it's worth," she added, her eyes dropping briefly. "I didn't know what they were planning when I signed on." "I believe you," Caleb said. She looked up, surprised. Not because of the words, because of the absence of blame in them. A small breath left her. Then her gaze shifted. Elena stood on the porch, Rowan in her arms. Marla's eyes rested there for a long moment. No anger, no accusation. Something else. Regret, maybe, or understanding. She reached into her coat pocket and pulled out a small, neatly folded blanket. Soft, pale blue, edges stitched by hand. "For him," she said. Caleb accepted it. "Thank you," he replied. Marla nodded. She didn't linger. She didn't look back. She returned to her car, drove away, and this time, the dust settled without tension. The night before the wedding, something unexpected happened. Ranger woke first. No sound had called him. No movement disturbed the house. But his eyes opened sharply, his body rising from the floor in one smooth motion. He moved toward the front door, not fast, not urgent, certain. Caleb stirred in the chair near the window. "What is it?" he murmured. Ranger stopped at the threshold. He did not bark. He did not scratch. He simply stood there, staring at the door as if something stood on the other side. Caleb rose slowly and opened it. The cold night air rushed in. The yard lay empty. No headlights, no footprints, no sound but the wind brushing through the pines. Ranger stepped forward onto the porch. He looked left, then right. Then he sat and stayed there, watching, waiting for something that did not arrive. Caleb stood beside him for a long moment. Then quietly, he closed the door. But Ranger did not move from his place near the threshold, as if guarding not from what might come in, but from what might try to leave. The wedding was small. There had been no formal planning. No invitation sent beyond word carried through the town in the same way all things traveled there, through conversation, shared coffee, and quiet understanding. A handful of people came. Nolan stood near the edge of the gathering, his coat buttoned against the cold, his expression unreadable but present. A woman from the diner brought food. A man from the hardware store helped set up a simple canopy made from old wood and canvas. No one asked too many questions. They didn't need to. The ceremony took place in the yard. The forest stood as witness. The greenhouse, alive behind them, reflected sunlight through its patched glass. Elena wore the same dress she had arrived in, Clean now, mended, still simple. Caleb stood beside her in his olive jacket, boots grounded firmly in the earth. They did not exchange long vows. They did not speak promises that needed embellishment. Just a few words, clear, certain, enough. Ranger lay near Rowan's cradle, not watching the crowd, not scanning the trees, just there, present. Time moved, not forward, not back, just onward. One morning, Elena stood in the doorway of the kitchen, her hand resting lightly against the frame. Caleb looked up from the table. She didn't speak immediately, didn't need to. He saw it in her face. "What?" he asked. Elena smiled slightly. "I'm pregnant." The words settled gently into the room. Caleb didn't react right away. He stood, walked past her, out onto the porch. The forest stretched before him, unchanged. And yet, everything had changed. There were still risks, still things that could be lost, still uncertainties waiting in the distance. But behind him, the house was warm. The cradle was occupied. A life had been built where nothing had been left. Caleb stood there for a long moment. Then he turned back. He didn't say anything dramatic, didn't reach for words that didn't fit him. "All right," he said simply. But this time, it meant something more. That evening, the light lingered longer than expected. The sun dipped behind the trees, leaving the sky soft and wide. Inside, Elena rocked Rowan gently. Ranger lay near the doorway, not guarding, not blocking, resting. Caleb stood at the threshold, one hand on the frame, the door behind him, open, the house behind him, alive, the forest before him, endless. And for the first time in a very long time, he did not feel the need to choose between them. Some stories don't arrive with thunder or miracles you can see. They come quietly, like a stranger at a gate, a door left open, or a hand that chooses not to turn away. Maybe what we call coincidence is something more. Maybe it's God moving gently through ordinary moments, placing the right people in our path when we need them most. Not to fix everything instantly, but to remind us that we are not meant to walk through life alone. Caleb thought strength meant standing by himself. But what changed his life wasn't force or control or even survival. It was the courage to let someone stay. And perhaps that is where grace begins, in the simple choice to open a door when it would be easier to close it. In our daily lives, we all have moments like that. A chance to help, a chance to listen, a chance to trust again, even after being hurt. And sometimes, the miracle is not that everything becomes perfect, but that something broken is given the chance to grow again. If this story meant something to you, take a moment to share it with someone who might need it today. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from, or what part of this story stayed with you the most. And if you'd like more stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to Veteran Dog Stories. May God watch over you, guide your path, and bring peace into your home, wherever you are.